This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, first of all, let's introduce this class by saying that I hope that this class will not always be taught in this room, because it's not very appropriate, and we're trying to find another room right now. But in any case, this is the modern African American freedom struggle. And what I'll do today is introduce this class by talking about Du Bois as a person who has made a unique contribution. And this will be a sample of the kind of lectures, because during this quarter I'll focus on a particular individual every day. And I'll use this individual as a way of describing certain themes that go much broader than that individual. I'll look at the relationships of that individual to others who made major contributions during that period. And I think it's really good to start with Du Bois, because he is such a central figure in African American history. One way of looking at his centrality is to look at the title of this recent biography, Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Du Bois, and you notice the subtitle, Biography of a Race. Imagine that, a biography of a single person being described as the biography of an entire race. And I think that Du Bois, to some degree, justifies, that's not an overstatement to say that by looking at his life, we can look at so many of the central themes in African American history. One of the things that Du Bois said about himself, actually, was that when he wrote one of his several autobiographies, he said, not completely immodestly, he said, "I think I might say without boasting that in the period from 1910 to 1930, I was the main factor in revolutionizing the attitude of American Negroes toward caste. My stinging hammer blows made Negroes aware of themselves, confident of their personalities, of their possibilities, and determined in self-assertion. So much so that today common slogans among the Negro people are taken bodily from the words of my mouth." Well, you can see he had definitely a very large view of his role, and I think that when we look at his life after the point in this film, at the beginning of the century, within the 20th century, and he starts the 20th century already 32 years old, I think it can be said without question that he is the most influential American intellectual of the century. Imagine a book written in 1903, Souls of Black Folk, which still outsells any of the books that I've written today. So this, I think, indicates that people are still concerned about Du Bois's attitudes and the way in which he conceptualizes the issues of race in America. One of the things I think we could also say is that all subsequent scholarship about African Americans, all the stuff that we do, all the stuff that is done in CSRE and the African American Studies program, can in some ways be seen as a footnote to what Du Bois has already said. I mean, if you want to know what CSRE does, look at the first page of Souls of Black Folk. It outlines the whole agenda for the program. If you want to look at what we do in terms of African American sociology, look at the Philadelphia Negro, written more than 100 years ago. If you want to see an engaged intellectual, somebody who makes a contribution in terms of his scholarship, but also makes a major contribution in terms of public discussion of issues, a public intellectual, as Cornel West would say, well, Cornel West learned all of his lessons at the foot of Du Bois. He is, without question, the preeminent intellectual. But I think he's also the preeminent political thinker of the 20th century. Just a few of the things that would kind of outline this role. If you look at what he did with the souls of black folk, how many of you are aware of the themes in the souls of black folk? How many have read it, by the way? No one? Anyone kind of know about the book? Okay, tell me one of the themes.
For I think one of my IHOM courses we read the story of John, I think. And one of the things that stuck out was the part with the two Johns and how the black John was talking about the more he knew, the more unhappy he got because he learned how disturbing the world can be and everything.
Okay.
Here's the story with the white John and the black John, and the black John went to the north to like learn and then bring Alex back down to where he was raised and stuff. But I can't. What happened in the end? Like how was?
Well, it kind of gets to the differences in terms of perspectives of race, the way in which people of different race perceive things differently based on their backgrounds, and that was a new insight. Anything else that? Yes.
The famous debate between himself and Booker T. Washington.
Right, and what was that debate? The Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois. What were they arguing about? Because that's a debate that's still going on today, over 100 years later. Yes.
This argument was featured about the way in which African Americans could, I guess, function in a racist society where prejudice was very prominent. Booker T. Washington felt that African Americans could function separately, not in the social aspects of society they could function and still be okay, while W.E.B. Du Bois felt that it would benefit African Americans to immerse themselves within society as a whole and not isolate themselves away.
Okay, Booker T. Washington would probably say, going to a liberal arts school like Stanford, what is it going to do for you? It's not a practical skill. We need to cast down our buckets where we are. In 1903, where are most African Americans? They're in the rural South. They need practical skills, and this is what he is arguing. But in a broader sense, he's arguing, lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. Don't think that by integrating into American society you're going to improve the race. You're just going to escape from the race, and it's probably a useless attempt to try to escape. Liberal arts education versus vocational education. All of these debates are still going on. Separatism versus integration. All of these ideas that came out of that debate are still divide the black community. And I think, quite frankly, many African Americans in their own psyche have elements of the Du Bois position and have elements of the Washingtonian position on in that debate. What else in the book? There's a chapter called the Sorrow Songs that have to do with the importance of African American culture as particularly expressed through music. That's an insight that no one else was putting forward at that time. Yes.
In one chapter he talks about the talented tenth.
The talented tenth. How many of you know that idea? Yes, please.
The talented tenth means that the top 10% just go and become as educated as possible and come back to help the rest of the community.
Okay. I see a few members of the talented 10th right here in this classroom. Are you all going to get your Stanford educations and going to come back and help bring up the race? That's an idea that Du Bois put forward. So all of this was part of his contribution. If he had just written nothing else, if he had died in 1904, he would have still been an important figure in African American life. We would still be talking about him today. But what did he do in 1905? Anyone know? 1905, the Niagara Movement, the first civil rights protest organization ever formed by black Americans. So it's a forerunner of the NAACP, which he founds in 1909. Anyone here heard of Pan-Africanism? Why would Du Bois be considered the father of Pan-Africanism? Well, while he's doing all of this, he's going off 1900 to the first Pan-African Congress. Key figure there. And in all the subsequent Pan-African meetings going up through the 1940s, all calling for the unity and the liberation of African people wherever they are in the world. This is something that he's involved in from the beginning of the century. He is an ally and a friend of all of the leaders who emerge in independent Africa during the 1950s and 60s. So is that enough? Well, he goes on from there and founds a journal called The Crisis, the journal of the NAACP. The NAACP is the major and oldest civil rights organization still around more than 100 years later. And as the founder of it and the founder of its journal, The Crisis, he becomes the most influential African American intellectual of his time. This is not like today when The Crisis might be one of many magazines around that present the ideas of black people. When it was formed, it was one of the few, and certainly the most influential national magazine. A whole generation of African Americans grew up waiting for The Crisis to arrive. Why? Because they would find out news about what was going on in the African American community throughout the nation, and sometimes throughout the world. They would find out not only political news through Du Bois's editorials about issues such as lynching, issues such as World War I, what position should we take? Should we fight? Should we not fight? What did he say on that question, by the way? Said we should. Why? Why should we fight in the war? It wasn't an African American war. It wasn't to free the colonies in Africa.
Was it that, if we showed the rest of America that we were, patriotic as they were, then they would appreciate it?
Yeah, he writes an editorial called Close Ranks. Says, we need to contribute to the war effort, march off to war, and when we return, we come back marching to get our rights in the United States. Later on, he quite regrets that, because after the war comes one of the most racist periods in American history, more race riots, the cracking down on black militancy. This is when J. Edgar Hoover gains his reputation as a person fighting subversion within the United States, trying to get people like Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, well, how does he relate to Du Bois? They actually, yeah.
Wasn't he got back to Africa, was it?
Yeah, Marcus Garvey, he's a Jamaican, comes to the United States. After Booker T. Washington, about the time when Booker T. Washington dies, Marcus Garvey arrives as a Booker T. Washington person, because he believes in that lift yourself up by your bootstraps. And he has an electric effect, gets a mass following, something that Du Bois never does get, because Marcus Garvey talks more to the working classes. He tries to appeal to those who are not able to move in the circles that Du Bois moves in. Marcus Garvey goes and over to the NAACP headquarters in New York after he arrives there. He knocks on the door and comes in. And what does he see? Here is a very dark-skinned Jamaican coming to the United States. He walks into the office and he says, "Everybody looked white. Even the black people looked white." And he said, "This is the organization that's leading the black people. It doesn't look like the people he knew in Harlem." He talks to Du Bois, and they don't hit it off. I mean, Du Bois has a lot of qualities. One of them is that he doesn't suffer people who are not quite as intelligent as he is very easily. And for him to relate to Du Bois, he saw him as a demagogue, someone who was kind of appealing to people who were not very reflective, trying to get their money for this thing called the Black Star Steamship Line. This was, really, in his view, just kind of a hustle that was going to put money in the pockets of people in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey, you can imagine, he saw Du Bois, another light-skinned, mixed race kind of person who was not really interested in the position of the majority of black people. He was interested in integrating into the majority society, even though he was a militant in his own terms. So the two did not hit it off. Their exchanges were very sharp during the early 1920s, kind of yelling names at each other, trying to. In fact, Du Bois was very happy when the government finally cracked down on Garvey, charged him with mail fraud, appealing for money through the mail for this kind of fraudulent Black Star Steamship Line, threw him in prison, and ultimately kicked him out of the country. What does this indicate about Du Bois, though? I think that one of the things that he learns from the Garvey experience is that he has to become more concerned about the position of the black majority, the black masses. Even before that, he considers himself somewhat of a socialist, someone who is concerned about trying to deal with the economic problems of the time. He's close to some people in the Socialist Party, but the Socialist Party at that point is mostly white people. As far as black-white unity, especially black working class unity and white working class unity, he knows that that's not likely to happen. It's white workers who are in the mobs that are lynching black people. So he faces this dilemma in the 1920s. But the point I would make overall is that by the time we get to the end of the 1920s, he's at the height of his influence. He's a person who has accomplished a great deal. He's approaching 60 years old. Some people, when they're approaching 60 years old, might even be thinking about retirement, might even be thinking that their best years are behind them. He also, at this stage, has enormous influence, enormous not only influence but contacts, networks throughout the country. And one thing that kind of, to me, brings this home is in 1928, his daughter. It's mentioned in the film that his son dies. He has a daughter. And in 1928, she decides to get married. He's very happy about that. Decides to have a major wedding, in part because she's marrying County Cullen. County Cullen is a poet, black poet, leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance. You can kind of imagine the pride of a father. Here he is in Harlem. His daughter is going to marry a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance. This is going to be the big event. And of course, he's editor of the Crisis, so guess what? The Crisis is even going to cover this. 1,300 invitations go out. And actually, if everyone who wanted to be at the wedding had been invited to the wedding, it would have been probably 13,000 invitations had gone out, because for months after that, Du Bois has to encounter people who are angry because they were not invited to attend this event. It is probably the social event of the decade. But one of the things I would say about Du Bois is, as brilliant as he was, some things he had blind spots. And one of the things that I will develop about each of these individuals is that they had their strengths, they had their weaknesses. One of the blind spots for Du Bois were the questions of gender, sexuality. He tried to struggle with it. And you can see in his writings him struggling with these issues, trying to come to terms, as he came to terms with everything else, looking at it rationally, looking at it as a social scientist might look at it. I think we can see W.E.B. Du Bois's complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes about gender and about raising children in his essay that he writes on the eve of his daughter's marriage. The essay is called So the Girl Marries, which he published in The Crisis, which was, of course, the magazine that he edited. And it was published in June of 1928. The problem of marriage among our present American Negroes is a difficult one. On the one hand go conflicting philosophies. Should we black folk breed children or commit biological suicide? On the other hand, should we seek larger sexual freedom or closer conventional rules? Should we guide and mate our children like the French, or leave the whole matter of sex intermingling to the chance of the street, like Americans? These are puzzling questions, and all the more so because we do not often face them honestly. Du Bois goes on to talk about his role in his daughter's selection of a spouse. My part in mate selection was admittedly small, but I flatter myself not altogether negligible. We talked the young men over, their fathers and grandfathers, their education, their ability to earn particular sorts of living, their dispositions. All this, incidentally, mind you, not didactically or systematically. Once or twice I went along on long letter hunts for facts. Usually facts were all too clear and only deductions necessary. What was the result? I really don't know. Sometimes I suspect that the girl arranged it all, and that I was the large and solemn fly on the wheel. At other times I flatter myself that I was astute, secret, wise, and powerful. Truth doubtless lurks between. So the girl marries. I remember the boy came to me somewhat breathlessly one Christmas Eve with a ring in his pocket. I told him, as I had told others, ask her, she'll settle the matter, not I. But he was a nice boy, a rather unusual boy with the promise of fine manhood. I wished him luck, but I did not dare plead his cause. I had learned. Thus the world grew and blossomed and changed, and so the girl marries. It is the end of an era, the sudden break and beginning. I rub my eyes and readjust my soul. I plan frantically. It will be a simple, quiet ceremony. In a church, Father. Oh, in a church? Of course, in a church. Well, a church wedding would be a little larger, but with County's father and the Reverend Fraser Miller assisting. Well, to be sure. Well, I guess that's possible, and indeed probable. And there will be 16 bridesmaids. One has to be firm somewhere, but my dear, whoever heard of 16 bridesmaids? So, 1,300 were bidden to the marriage, and no human being has 1,300 friends. 500 came down to greet the bride at a jolly reception which I had originally planned for 25. Of course, I was glad they were there. I expanded and wished for 1,000. 3,000 saw the marriage, and 1,000 waited in the street. It was a great pageant, a heart-swelling throng. The symbolism of that procession was tremendous. It was not the mere marriage of a maiden. It was not simply the wedding of a fine young poet. It was the symbolic march of young and black America, because there was Harvard, Columbia, Smith, Brown, Howard, Chicago, Syracuse, Penn, and Cornell. There were 3 Masters of Arts and 14 bachelors. There were poets, teachers, actors, artists, and students. But it was not simply conventional America. It had a dark, shimmering beauty all its own, a calm, high restraint, and a sense of new power. It was a new race, a new thought, a new thing rejoicing in a ceremony as the old of the world.
So you get a little bit of a taste of Du Bois's way of looking at everything rationally, trying to mull over all of the various aspects of it. And what is surprising is that in all of this musing about the wedding of his daughter, he misses the most obvious point, that most of the people in Harlem knew, at least most of the people in the artistic community, and that is that County Cullen was very gay. When they went off for a honeymoon, County Cullen went off with his lover to Paris in order to set up the place for his bride. She arrived to find that there was someone who had already been there, and so Du Bois was the last to know the most essential fact about human relations with respect to his daughter. I think that this episode indicates where I would like to take the Du Bois story in the next lecture, and that is, he's a really great example of what happens from 1928, when the wedding takes place, through the rest of his life. As I mentioned, by 1928 he's already 60 years old. Many people would be thinking about winding down their career. For Du Bois, though, this was just another beginning. I can think of very few people during the next 35 years who have as much impact on such of a wide variety of things as Du Bois does. The major events of that period are all have their impact on him, and he has their impact on them. 1929, what happens? The beginning of the Great Depression. As an officer in the NAACP, he tries to respond to the Depression by changing the organization, by trying to get it to see that the need to reach out to working class individuals, to deal with the economic problems of the Depression. This, of course, leads him into conflict with the director of the NAACP, a man by the name of Walter White. And the Du Bois-Walter White conflict shapes many of the debates of the 1930s. In the lectures that I'll do for this course, I'll talk about other individuals that also Du Bois interacts with. Shirley Graham, who's about 30 years younger than Du Bois, and I think reflects what happens to artists, intellectuals, as they encounter the Depression, and many of them move to the left, move toward the Communist Party during that decade. Paul Robeson, the most important artistic figure of that time, the leading actor, leading singer. It's hard today to even find a parallel for the kind of dominant role that Paul Robeson played in terms of African American art during the 1930s and 1940s. And yet, Paul Robeson also plays a major role in terms of the political changes of not simply the Depression years, but World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Bayard Rustin, who probably, how many of you have heard the name? Just one. And Rustin is, I think, important because he was one of the people who helped found the Congress of Racial Equality, developed the tactics of the civil rights movement of the post-war years. He was the organizer of the March on Washington. How many of you knew that? So all of these people came out of the context of the 1930s, of the Depression years. And I would add to that Ella Baker, who plays a major role in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and even into the 1960s. And of course, Martin Luther King. Now, Du Bois interacts with many of these people. He is a person who goes through many, many changes, writes a number of important books during the 30s, one of them, Black Reconstruction, perhaps the most important work of history of that time, because Du Bois is the first one to understand the role of black people during the Reconstruction era, turning around the dominant historical account that Reconstruction was this terrible period in American history in which ignorant black people suddenly gained political power and were not able to hold it, and the redeemers, white people who came back in to reestablish decent government in the South. That was the story that was told in most historical accounts before Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction in the mid-1930s. During the 1940s, he is a leader, not simply in terms of African Americans as a member of the NAACP, but as a Pan-Africanist, playing a central role in assisting the movement for African independence, and more broadly, independence of what we now call the Third World. Now, one of the things that we'll have later on in this class is Awele will be doing a guest lecture on the women who made the Montgomery bus boycott. And she's spent many years studying these women, and her dramatic account of this comes out of that experience of actually talking to many of these women, interviewing them, and using their words to tell that story, which is usually told as the story of Martin Luther King, but instead should be understood as a story of how Martin Luther King was handed an already successful movement by women who organized it. I'll also be talking about Bob Moses, who some of you should know that name, and once you've read the book In Struggle, you'll be more familiar with his contribution to the African American freedom struggle. Then we'll have Vincent Harding, one of the major figures in African American history, come in for a guest lecture, one of 3 lectures on Martin Luther King. Why 3 lectures on Martin Luther King? Well, I'm teaching the course, and I think if you come out of this class knowing more about Martin Luther King than you can get in other classes, I think that would be a real benefit. And also because Vincent Harding and another person who will give a guest lecture, Clarence Jones, worked directly with Martin Luther King, were his key aides, helped write his speeches, and played a central role, so they will be able to talk about not only King, but their personal reflections about their relationships with Martin Luther King. And of course then, after the midterm, we'll go to Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. Erica Huggins will do a guest lecture on the Black Panther Party as a person who was in the Black Panther Party from its early days in Oakland and founded the Oakland Community School, which was the last surviving institution of the Black Panther Party And then Angela Davis, Jesse Jackson, Tanisha Armstrong, one of the TAs for the class, will do a lecture on Alice Walker. And then Tupac Shakur. And finally, a lecture about Barack Obama, who I think brings a lot of the themes to the present day, and will probably go up to December not knowing what the outcome of that story will be. So all of this will be in conjunction with learning from the readings. And those of you can see that the central thread of the course will come from the textbook that I co-wrote called The Struggle for Freedom. And you'll be responsible for chapters 15 through the end of the book. Juan Williams' book on Thurgood Marshall covers certainly a major figure. If I didn't cover him in the book, I would certainly have to cover him as with one of my lectures. The autobiography of Martin Luther King. In Struggle, which I mentioned, the story of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most dynamic and militant of the civil rights groups of the 1960s, and Joseph Peniel's Till the Midnight Hour, which takes the story of Black Power into the 1970s. Just a few words about the requirements for the course. First of all, there will be a required section, and with our TAs, Tanisha Armstrong, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Hi. My name is Tanisha Armstrong. I am the Associate Director at the King Institute here at Stanford. I've been TAing this course for, 6 or 7 years now, and I'm really happy to do that.
And Julie?
All right, I'm a fourth year in the Department of History, studying 20th century Jewish history, and also happy to see you all here, and I'll be happy to meet you later this evening.
One of the things we've done in this course is, in addition to having the sections, is to give a research option for students. Those of you, or most of you, are probably aware that there's the King Institute here on campus, which was established when Coretta Scott King named me to edit Martin Luther King's papers, and since that time we've been producing a multi-volume edition of Martin Luther King's writings called The Papers of Martin Luther King. And at the Research Institute, we not only have that project going on, but the Liberation Curriculum Initiative to develop teaching materials for K through 12 schools, and we have various kinds of public programs, and I'll say a few words about that. Most recently, one of the programs was to present a play about Martin Luther King in Beijing this last summer, and 3 Stanford students were involved in that. We try to, as much as possible, have students involved in that research, and any of you who have an interest in that and want to do that in lieu of taking a final in the course, you're welcome to talk with me or with Tanisha about that possibility. I definitely encourage it. The midterm in this class, after all, is the major test for the class, because it is after most of the readings. The readings are relatively light after the midterm, so I would definitely urge you to not get behind in the readings. If everything kind of depends on how you do on the midterm, then it behooves you to try to get all the readings done ahead of time. Before you come into class, be prepared, have your readings completed before you get to that midterm. If you do well on the midterm, you will probably do well on the final, because the final will simply give you an essay pretty much on the same topics that the midterm will touch on in more short answer questions. So this course is definitely front loaded. When you leave this class, start your reading for next week. Do not get behind. This is something that it will be emphasized in the sections. The sections provide a wonderful opportunity for you to discuss the readings. Don't go to sections to find out about the readings, as some students sometimes do. None of the students in this class will do that, though. Beyond that, let's see. There will be a final exam, which will be kind of a traditional history exam with 3 questions. You have 3 hours to answer them. So those of you who want to do simply the midterm and the final, that's fine. It's a 4-unit class for you. If you want a 5th unit, I would encourage you to either get involved in the research in some ways, directed or independent research. You can also take on a topic of your own if you have something in mind that fits the topics of this course. Then you should talk with me as soon as possible. Are there any questions about that? No questions? Yes?
When will the session start this course?
Yeah, this week. Have you set up tentative times yet?
No, not yet. So what we'll do is you can go to coursework. I will send you all an email if you're enrolled in the course. You'll get an email from me letting you know which section to sign up for.
By the way, coursework, when I try it,
It's down.
but I'm hoping it'll be back. Okay. And you might have noticed that we're being filmed. And that's one of the things that's going to make the room very hot on a hot day like today. This is for the podcasting, which Stanford is doing. So after this class is over, not before it's over, you'll be able to download this on your iPods, and so next year's class will be able to watch this year's lectures on their iPods, but that will not be on a kind of go home and watch it. Otherwise, attendance might be down, but you'd rather see it live anyway, right? We also, as I mentioned before, we will try to get another room that is more spacious, particularly as we get our guest lectures, because more people come in for those. So, if I do find another room, through CourseWorks, we'll send an email to each of you saying where the new room is. So, no questions? Yeah.
Are we permitted to use laptops?
I have no problem with as long as they're quiet. So, okay. Thank you for coming. See you next time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.